The Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at CU Denver, and we're delighted to launch the first Friday breakfast, the first Friday breakfast of 2017. We hope you'll come to some others. They're always, or almost always, the first Friday. In February, actually February 3rd, our topic will be anchor institutions, so-called eds and meds, hospitals and universities, and their role in creating community wealth. In March, I think March 3rd, we'll have the Lieutenant Governor, Donna Lynn, here talking about the state's the Smart Performance Framework. And in April, we'll be focusing on infrastructure, transportation, public-private partnerships, which we think will be a big issue both in Colorado and perhaps nationally under the new administration. We're really excited to have you here. A few logistics to start. We do have this done as a webinar online. Last month we had about 20 people. So when we get to the questions, we'll have somebody coming around with a microphone, and there will be time for questions. And please ask the panel important pointed questions. But also at that point, please make them relatively concise so we can get as many questions in as possible. If you are a Twitter person, our hashtag is Spa First Friday. If you want to send out things to the broader world, we'd appreciate that. In terms of other logistics, please help yourself to food. If you need to leave before 9 o'clock, because we do finish around 9, please feel free to do that, but do so quietly. There's men's and ladies' rooms around the corner. And typically some of the panel members can stay around after 9 if you have individual questions that are pressing and you want to follow up on. So today's topic is affordable housing. That ranges, of course, from concerns about homelessness, which this time of year is especially a big concern. But in Denver now, with prices rising, Denver metro area, to concerns about people with more income and people moving here, middle income folks, can they afford to pay rent and buy houses? There's a lot of activity going on in this domain. We did a First Friday breakfast about a year ago on this topic, but a lot has changed since then. Denver has approved a $150 million fund for affordable housing. Other state and local entities have been doing quite a bit. And of course, we'll have a new presidential administration in about 10 days with a new HUD director. And I think it's hard to say what their focus is going to be in housing, but maybe some of our panelists have some thoughts, and that'll certainly emerge over time. There's also the continuing question of construction defects and condo development that the legislature may or may not address this year. They've talked about it the last few years, and some local governments have made some progress in that domain as well. So I think we have a lot to talk. It's one that even at the university we notice too. We recruit faculty from all over the country, and increasingly in the last couple of years, I've noticed that faculty are smart enough to realize that Denver is expensive, and they ask me for a bigger salary, and it gets a little tougher to attract talent. And I imagine that that's true not only at the university but at other places. I do want to thank our events team, Catherine Warner in back, Laura Pemberton, John Merritt, who's communications director, taking pictures, for making this come off so well and so smoothly. And next, I'll introduce our moderator, Todd Ely. Dr. Todd Ely is the head of our Center on Local Government here at the School of Public Affairs. He's an assistant professor who's about to be promoted to associate professor with tenure this year. Easy decision, I think, for the university to make. Todd's published widely in public finance, local public finance, education policy, local government issues. He has a PhD from New York University, an MPA from the University of Arizona, and is one of our best teachers and best faculty members. And he's going to help introduce the panel. Oh, I should say too, there are, if you didn't see them, there's bios of the panel members. There's a couple of PowerPoint slides available if you didn't grab those that we can pass around. That'll be some helpful background for what we're doing here as well. But with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Todd Ely, and our terrific panel that we have here this morning.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here. As Paul said, he gave a nice background. We had a session similar to this a year ago, and some things have changed. And I think for people that might make you feel optimistic, others, right, it hasn't changed fast enough. And so today we can talk about where we're at, and maybe as well, where we're going with regards to affordable housing. As far as bios, I could spend a lot of time on the background of the panelists, but I'll leave it to the bio sheet that you saw. And what I'd like to start with is just letting the panel members themselves provide a brief introduction, what they do, how they're tied to the affordable housing topic, and then, you know, take just a couple minutes to speak from their perspective, you know, why affordable housing is such a salient and important policy issue for the whole Denver metro area. So to start with, we'll have Councilman Albus Brooks kick it off, and then we'll continue down the line. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. You guys look bright and bushy-tailed this morning. I'm so encouraged at the crowd this morning, given the weather. So I appreciate you being here. My name is Albus Brooks. This is actually the district that I represent on City Council. I represent most of downtown and Northeast Denver, all the way up into Globeville area, Swansea. And I am the president of Denver City Council, and I've been very involved in the city. And I just want to, you're going to hear a lot today, but I just want to set the table that we are in an affordable housing crisis in most major cities in the United States. And I'll just make the statement that I believe we're in this place because of utter failure of our federal government and over 70% funding cuts of major federal housing. Cities are forced to get very complex in trying to figure out some financing of how we take care of this issue within our cities. And states are stepping up as well and coming up with affordable housing funds, which is incredible. We're starting to see cities around housing declare a state of emergency because it is such a crisis. And so this is one of the most important things that I deal with on a daily basis. We just ran a scientific private poll, and affordable housing wasn't the number one issue. I'm sure you can guess what the number one issue that 9 out of 10 people in Denver agree on, and it's traffic and congestion and transportation and infrastructure. So thank you for having a forum on that as well. But affordable housing is number 2. And so it's on everyone's mind. And we as a city feel like we took a big step forward on September to really say, hey, we're going to make this a priority. So it's something that I'm focused on, and I'm excited for the conversation today.
Great, thank you. We'll go ahead and move next to Pat Coyle, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Local Affairs.
Thank you, and good morning as well. So it is a partnership, and you've got to focus on the partnership in front of you and in this room as to what it takes to address the housing issue, and it's public and private. I say that because later in the conversation, we will talk about whether it's national politics or local politics, the stability of the community and the messaging is critical for investment to flow. The state piece of this partnership, I just wanted to take in my introductory remarks, if we're going to be talking about what's next, we have to take a look back 5 years. We're not going to go all the way back to the recession, I can tell you, and you can tell me what was happening there. But what's important to look at is in the past 5 years, and if you look at what the greatest demand for housing has been those folks in our state that are earning less than $20,000. One person, a family of 4, you can imagine, that are paying 50% of their income for rent. There's 153,500 folks in 2011 in that category. I want you to keep that number in mind throughout the day, because this year there are 153,800 folks. I should say households for all statisticians out there. The number hasn't moved. But we have increased population, 130,000 households. Rents have gone up from $880 for a two-bedroom apartment in 2011 to $1,700 now. Incomes are flat. That number should have moved unless we were doing something. So we can reflect on today what's been done, because as a city, the state, private interest invest, we've got to maintain what we're doing. We've got to increase what we're doing. And to focus on what's on the table in the last 5 years, just to throw out a few numbers, in 2011, the state was spending $0 on housing vouchers, things that we call Section 8 of the federal government. Today, we're spending almost $3 million. With the partnership in the Department of Local Affairs and HUD, we've had a disaster. We spent over $83 million in housing in the past 3 years. The Attorney General has invested over $40 million from the National Mortgage Settlement into affordable housing in the last 3 years. There has been an enormous effort on the part of the state to actually increase the monies that go into grants from 2.2 to 8.2 million. We have a request in to even increase that by another 2 million this year. Homelessness has dropped from 15,000 folks to 10,000 folks in that time period. Significant indicators, though, have increased this past year in the most chronic population, so we got to keep an eye on that. But understand that progress is actually being made. The task is huge. And in this year, we'll be asking, and you may have read about it in the paper, for up to $16.2 million in the marijuana revenue that we're seeing at the state to invest in housing for homeless folks. I set the stage in that context so we can talk about the future and where we're going. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pat. Now we'll move on to Stephen Johnson, who's the Director of Community Development for the Colorado Housing Finance Authority.
Thank you, good morning. I'm gonna take a little bit of a national perspective for you. And briefly, I wanna mention some reasons for pessimism and some reasons for optimism. If there are any fans of BBC television out there that have ever watched the Cranford series, you'll know the quote from one of the characters, and it is, "Speculation is the enemy of calm." And I think that pretty well sums up what we've been facing for the past 30 days as a result of the national election. I'm going to focus on one program in particular that we manage. It's the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. I'm curious, by show of hands, how many people are familiar with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program? Excellent. Okay. So very briefly, for those of you who aren't, this was a seminal piece of legislation that was passed in 1986 as part of the second round of Reagan tax cuts. Arguably by accident, it was passed after, if you think about what happened at that time, you had all of these tax preferences that were eliminated, tax shelters that were eliminated. It was that moment of saying, I think we just eliminated all of the tax shelters that were creating affordable housing. And so kind of as an alternative, they created the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And it's amazing in what it does. It shifts the burden from the federal government to private developers like one you're going to hear from next, to say, I'll take the risk, and in return, this program will provide a subsidy to the developer to the tune of probably 70% of the development cost. So this program has been responsible for creating probably over 90% of all affordable housing in the United States. In Colorado, 40,000 units. When we talk about affordability, we're saying those individuals and families earning less than 60% of the area median income. So that's who we're talking about. If you represented the city of Denver in this room, then 25% of you, so about 40 of you, are spending more than 50% of your income on rent. If you're in the 30 to 60% AMI range and you're spending more than half of your income on rent, you're having to make some pretty hard choices on the rest of your budget. Healthcare, transportation, other issues that we talk about. So this program is incredible in its scope. So why doesn't it solve the problem? It's very limited. So we can only build maybe 2,000 units a year in Colorado, across the entire state with this program. So the gap is incredible. So where is the fear? For this program to be successful, a couple of things have to happen. If you're a developer, first of all, we're giving you tax credits. Well, tax credits really don't have any value to you because you want cash, not a tax credit. You've got to find somebody to sell that tax credit to. And those tax credits have incredible value in the market to the tune of, a couple of weeks ago, I heard $1.31. So I have a tax credit. I sell it to you, and you give me $1.31 for $1 of credit. That's a pretty good deal. There's a lot of reasons why they're paying over $1. We won't go into that. But the other piece of it, I've got to get some financing. And so I've got to have a good, robust lending market. Those are the two things. Now think about what's happened over the past 30 days. There's this talk of tax reform. If you're buying tax credits and there's tax reform and you're a corporate entity that bought those tax credits assuming a 35% corporate rate, what happens if we really get a 20% corporate rate or a 15% corporate rate? The value of that tax credit goes down. So right now there's an incredible fear in the market where projects that are ready to come out of the ground are not even getting bids. Lenders facing the same issue. We're seeing tremendous increases in interest rates. So those are two things I want you to keep on your radar screen as you think about what you hear after the election. Comprehensive tax reform, corporate tax reform. Those are good things that have kind of that can have a bad side, a negative impact. And so as a market, what we're doing is suggesting ways to offset that. Can we do things through accounting, advanced depreciation, things that will help offset that? But let me give you a few things that I think some big risks. So tax reform, I mentioned. One, this corporate tax is going to be a big, big issue. So watch that. Labor costs. So the biggest impact to these affordable housing properties has been the increase in labor cost. Of the last 5 years, we've seen anywhere from 30 to 40% rise, both in material and labor cost. So ask yourself what immigration reform and massive spending on infrastructure does to an already limited labor pool. I think that's something that we just need to be aware of. And then NIMBY, I mentioned they say that's an odd one to throw on your list, Steve. So NIMBY is becoming a greater and greater issue. And I think if there are developers in the room, each one of them can tell you a story from the past year of how they've either walked away from a deal that was fully permitted, properly zoned, used by right, because they couldn't deal with what was happening in the neighbors around them. And there's just a greater desire to, well, let's use the term fake news. And it's very easy now to spread fear amongst the neighborhood. And I've seen more and more at Chaff as we look across the state. And I will give kudos. The best way to offset NIMBYism is a city that is prepared to deal with affordable housing. And ironically, you see much less of that in the city of Denver than you do in some of the surrounding communities, because Denver has said affordable housing is important to us. Let me give you some, just close here with some reasons for optimism. Affordable housing is in the headlines. That's pretty cool. Nationally, it's in the headlines. Locally, it's in the headlines. Republicans talk about it. Democrats talk about it. That's a good place to be right now. We need to take advantage of that. Housing is an economic driver, and people get that now. We can show how many jobs that as construction of these units creates. We've got good bipartisan national support. And one of the things that was just mentioned, these anchor institutions, they're starting to get into housing. Hospitals are starting to think about housing and the role of housing and what is their role in the community. We have a state credit that was passed a few years back. That state credit has done more to drive additional housing, double the number of units that are coming out of the ground. It's a limited resource. It's only around for 3 more years. It's something that another thing we're going to have to go back and deal with, but for now, it's been incredible. And then I would say for the last thing, and this goes back to Denver, many cities are motivated to drive effective affordable housing policy. So just a few things to think about. Optimism, we can dig into those later, but speculation is the enemy of calm. That's your takeaway today.
Excellent, thank you. Previously Pat mentioned that, this is a partnership, affordable housing, and the private sector plays an important role. And we're lucky to have Mike Zoellner here, who's President and Chief Operating Officer of RedPeak Apartments.
Thank you, and good morning. So as the private capital, private markets guy in the room, I'm going to try to give you some reasons for optimism also, and maybe some ideas that we've come up as an industry for some possible solutions. My background is market rate as well as LIHTC and Section 8 kinds of development. So we've been on both sides of those projects, and I think have an unusual perspective. I think first, just to set the table for market conditions, and I think it's important that certainly we have an affordable housing problem, no doubt about that, and I don't want to in any way minimize the impact of that and just where it's at. But I do think as an industry, you know, the apartment industry has been, in the end, this comes down to a supply-demand imbalance to some extent. And so we have been building a lot of apartments, if you haven't noticed, around town. Today, a lot of the headlines that you see in terms of where vacancy rates are, I think are in some ways misleading. Who would be surprised in the room today for the overall Metro Denver vacancy rate to be at 9%? Does that surprise anybody? That's where we are today. For apartments that you can move into this weekend, Denver metro area, it's a 9% vacant market. The downtown vacancy rate today for apartments you can move into this weekend is 19%. That's sort of surprising, I think, to a lot of people. So not that I don't want to minimize the importance of the topic or where we are in trying to solve this, but so supply and demand is part of it, but pricing is the biggest problem, right? That's the issue. That's the biggest problem. What we're building are apartments that are at $2,000 a month or more when people can afford, you know, $800 or $1,000 a month. That's the issue. So, so we as an industry have been trying to come up with some solutions and some ideas. What was in the handout that you may have seen is a new idea. Not that this is a silver bullet or any way to solve this in one swoop, but it might be one arrow in the quiver for policymakers like Albus and others, you know, here to say, here's a way that we can take some of these new resources that are going toward affordable housing to make an immediate impact. So I think I applaud the city of Denver for the new $15 million a year targeted affordable housing fund. We were very supportive of that. We think it's a great first step. And but how's that money going to be spent? It's hard for us to imagine how you're going to build your way out of an affordable housing problem, partly because the housing costs or the development costs, the construction costs today are at all-time highs. And so if you start to think about, I think the $15 million a year over 10 years, 150 million, and we're trying to get 6,000 units out of that 10-year fund, that's $25,000 a unit. So how far is $25,000 a unit going to go when the cost of developing new units is $250,000 to $300,000 a unit? So there's another pricing problem we have coming, right? Not just the rent differential, but the resources that are going to this issue is very different than the cost to build new. So it would be unrealistic for anyone to think that we're going to build our way out of an affordable housing problem from our perspective. So what you have in the table, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's essentially a forgivable subordinated loan. This is a program that's voluntary. It's been endorsed. It was started with the Apartment Association of Metro Denver, and now the Downtown Denver Partnership has also endorsed it. And what we're doing is taking existing units and where the owner of those units comes to the city and says, for example, I'm interested in putting 10% of my units in my building into an affordable housing pool. And I'm willing to reduce my rents from market rents to affordable rents. And different people can disagree about affordable rents, whether that's 40% of AMI, 60% of AMI, 80% of AMI, whatever that is, policymakers to decide what is it that they want to target, but that will impact what the cost is for reducing the rent for that owner. So this is it's a way to have an immediate impact on where units could be placed in service next month if a deal is cut today. And if it's a 10-year program, then essentially 10% of that upfront payment gets forgiven each year over the 10 years. If it's a 20-year set aside of rents, 5% of that would be reduced each year in that forgivable loan scenario. And we think this is worth considering. It's an idea that might have some merit as we think about where we're going to go with these, how we're going to utilize these funds and where we're going to implement them. And that from a policy point of view, integrating affordable units into market rate units is a really good solution. We think that's a great way to manage these assets, as opposed to saying this is an affordable building, 100% of these rents are restricted and imposed. It also has this feature of self-policing, because the other 90% of the units need to be, I mean, the building needs to be maintained, obviously. The amenities are still open to everyone who lives there, and it's transparent to anybody who's there, just who is the affordable unit and who's not. So we think it's an idea worth considering, and there's some more details about that in the handout. But it's that's something that we wanted to bring to the table as private markets, as an industry, to say maybe this is something we could consider. I can tell very interested in this and who want to be part of the solution. We are hiring people all the time too. We understand the issue. We want to be part of a solution, and here's an idea that we wanted to bring to the table for at least consideration.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Mike. So I'll go ahead and start off with a couple questions before opening it to the audience. And the fact that so many people knew about low-income housing tax credits suggests you know a lot about this, and we'll have some excellent questions for the panel. The way I'd like to start, I mean, part of the impetus is this, new $150 million fund over 10 years, for the city and county of Denver. And I glanced at the city and county's CAFR and said, what is the value of the residential property in Denver? And best I could was $40 billion, right? So when you start looking at, the size of the fund, right? I know that was a concern for affordable housing advocates about what can be done with it. But what would be really helpful for me to hear is the opinion of the panelists about what the most effective use of funds are for promoting affordable housing. I know the $150 million fund is going to be a mix, right? There's going to be, low-income rentals. There's going to be some emergency assistance, and the public sector has been trying to support affordable housing for a long time, and I'd love to hear what the state of the art is in our understanding of the most effective use of dollars for this area.
I'll take that on. First of all, when we passed the $150 million affordable housing fund, there were two sides of it. There was a side from advocates saying, "Are you serious? That's it?" And that was completely understandable, because today there's 31,000 rent burden individuals. There's over 20,000 severely rent burden individuals in this city, which means they're making choices between food, clothing, shelter, which is scary, especially on nights like days like this. So, but what I want to help people see is that this is a start, that this is just the beginning. There are many other opportunities and funds in the city that we can use to leverage this. And seeing what the state proposal that's on the table, that's really exciting to a city like Denver, because that's exactly the kind of partnership that we're looking for in ways that we can leverage these funds. I'm glad that you mentioned emergency rental assistance. There are a package of policy items that came with the $150 million fund. And one of them is emergency assistance. One of them is down payment assistance for folks who are purchasing home. And the other is preservation. Let's not forget that there are deed restricted properties in the city, a lot in my district, that in the next 5 to 10 years, their deeds will be running out and they will be going into a market rate solution. And so we as a city passed an ordinance that gives Denver the first right of refusal over all deed restricted properties in a preservation perspective. And so one of the ways that I feel like I think is really important is to start thinking about what it means to preserve affordable housing in the city. And I have to agree with Mike. Another way is to partner with market rate developers and see how we can invest in some of their solutions and some of their developments as well. You will not build your way out over this under $50 million. There's only 6,000 units that we're looking at, but I firmly believe that there's other ways that we can leverage these funds to make it go on.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts on that?
Let me just put some numbers to it. So if you do generally almost all the units affordable, the average gap that we see is about $3 million on an average size project. That's about 70, 75 units. That $3 million gap is what the state credit was so effective at filling, but it's a limited resource and it has a timeline to it. And so as you start to think about how much per deal or what kind of money are we talking about, they're pretty big dollars. And it's got to be in the form of something that allows the project to cash flow, because these projects take on as much debt as a lender is willing to give them. So when you think about building a property, $3 million, if your fund is $3 million, you're not going to build much more than one. But that's why the numbers of 150 million, you really start to have some scale. We talked about the credit pricing. Every time the credit pricing drops by 2 cents, that's 1 unit that you can't build in your property. So 2 cents equals 1 unit. And so as you have that drop, it just creates more gaps. And that's why whether it's the city's revolving loan fund that they rolled out in 2015 or this fund, these are such necessary tools, whether it's all affordable or whether just part of it's affordable, to be able to backfill those gaps that the lender can't do and the equity can't do.
Just one comment on Mike's proposal, and as well as the overall supply and demand formula. We get this a lot when we will go before the legislature and you have people that understand what a free market is. Housing is not a free market. It doesn't operate that way. So if there is this vacancy, we're looking at properties in Denver, existing properties, maintaining the quality of those properties, investing dollars to bring code improvements and amenities to existing properties and investing in them, absorbing some of the vacancy. I can see that happening. The other piece to this is you have a bottom, you have a floor. You build so much and then the prices will go down. You build so much, you still have the existing properties to maintain and take care of. And whatever that rent is, it's going to be charged. And certainly that's where we want to be able to increase within the overall housing stock what's affordable. And it is probably a very efficient and cost-effective way, in addition to building something new, because you don't. But as far as the question about local policies, it also comes to land. It's the variable in all of this in new construction is the land cost, and it is screaming in the Front Range. So controlling that land cost now, controlling the risk of that land, is also the companion piece to this investment and the leverage of private money.
Great, yeah.
Just something to add, and I don't in any way mean to be controversial, but this is an academic setting, and I'm sort of the free market guy on the panel. So free market, we should at least talk about it. I think affordable housing means a lot of different things to different people, and it's a huge issue, no doubt about it. and don't want to in any way minimize it, but I would tell you there's a lot of people in the city who, many of whom are paying the developer fees, you know, they're funding part of this, paying the increased property taxes that are part of this. If you ask a lot of those folks, where should this money be spent? Not that, and I know there's a lot of homeless housing folks in the room here today. I don't want to in any way minimize what that issue is all about. But in our minds, I would say homeless housing and what goes on with homeless housing and how it should be funded and the needs of homeless housing are different than what we think about as affordable housing. You know, there's a lot of, you know, working poor in the community is what we think about when we think about affordable housing. And when we start to blur the lines between what is an affordable housing issue and what is a homeless housing issue, and we combine all of them in affordable, I worry about that personally. And I think those are different. Those are should have different funding sources. They should have different resources attached to them, and we should treat those both very important in our community. But we worry that if part of this 150 million or 15 million a year starts to go to homeless as well as affordable, that we're really not going to have the impact that everyone hopes from these dollars.
Great.
Can I do a quick clarification? I said 30,000. I don't even know the numbers I just gave, but I want to give you accurate numbers. So 64,000 are rent burden in the city. 31,000 are severely rent burden. So I just want to make sure you have those numbers.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you know, the next question, as an outsider to the housing community, you know, I see all the development of mass transit, you know, the light rail system. I know there's a lot of transit-oriented development occurring. And it seems like affordable housing is very, very much, and you know, we didn't mean to just make this a Denver proper issue, but a metro and regional issue. And I'd love to hear how the problem is being addressed, you know, at the regional level, and kind of what those partnerships look like, and who the leader is on that. Is that the state playing that role? Have at it, whoever.
Thank you.
We've got two state people here.
Housing is a local issue. And I don't mean to dodge the question, but housing is a local market issue. It is a regional issue for metroplexes. You can't, if you picture housing as a state issue, can't do it. The needs of small towns are not, and the solutions in small towns are not the solutions here. The pricing difference. But it is a metro issue. And doesn't matter to an individual, the labor force, if they're living in Littleton or North Glen or Denver and they work somewhere else. It certainly matters to the delivery of services, transportation, and those things. But it is, and the fact that your question was, so who's leading it in the metro area? So there's a quiet in the room. It has to be led. I think the collection of mayors as the Metro Mayors Caucus and the like have played a role. Denver City Council certainly and the mayor have played a lead role. But as far as a single voice, you won't get that single voice because of local priorities in each jurisdiction. Where you've had cooperation is along with transit systems. And I think Denver is one of the leaders, Metro Denver is one of the leaders in being able to say, let's link housing with public transit. That's key. And going forward, I hope once the build out is happening in Denver proper, those communities on the periphery really take the lead from what Denver has done in affordable housing close to the metro stops, or the actual transit systems? If I dodge the question, let me know. But it's not. I tried to answer it in, we have to be in a supportive role in the state.
Sure. Yeah, Councilman.
So I got to be careful here because I asked Pat for a lot of help on projects in the city, but I completely disagree. As of now, I mean, let me just outline. I mean, I think I outlined the crisis and the severely rent burden. I mean, we got 30,000 people in the city today who are about to face homelessness. Let's just be honest about that. We are in a severe crisis in our state around housing. And it's not just a market issue. It's a serious crisis. And let me do a 5-point just on my district. In Northeast Denver, all of our poor schools are facing a decrease in enrollment because of gentrification that's happening in the city, and the suburbanization of poverty is starting to happen. So now it's impacting education on a grand scale in our city and state. I feel like the state needs to focus on this as a priority. Now, in my mind, they are doing it by matching this and leveraging funds on this homeless housing on marijuana funds. I think that's a very innovative, incredible way. But I think to take a leadership in the policy direction around the Front Range region with the Metro Mayor's Caucus and other opportunities. But I feel like this is a great opportunity for the state to step in and step up when our federal government, especially at this time, home funds, HOPWA funds, all of these things that we've depended on are decreasing at an enormous rate. We need our state. We need our state to step up and help us walk through this issue. Now, I'm just disagreeing, but I feel like this is a great opportunity.
So, I just want to grab him by the arm. We'll walk. You're coming with me, though.
Yeah, we intentionally seated next to each other.
Just a point of optimism here in the metro area. Well, the problem is if you have an affordable unit and you're at a transit stop, can you spend $10 round trip to take the transit? I mean, that's the real problem we're talking about. Is it affordable? We can build it there, but can the residents afford to use it? And there are conversations going on right now with RTD. Mile High Connects has taken a real lead role in that, saying what can we do, and are there investors that will come in and help backstop the potential loss to RTD of getting that, dealing with that fare issue, the affordable fare issue. So I'll go deep into that, but there are conversations now. We should do much more with this, but we're starting to ask ourselves, what good is it having a resident walking distance to a new transit stop if they can't afford to use it? It's a reasonable question.
And I want to piggyback on that.
Sure.
I'm sorry, because we're on transit, and this is something that's big in Denver that we're working on. But I just want to tell, if you are a private housing developer, if you are a business owner, buying transit passes for your employees and for the folks who live in your units, and you subsidize that, you can write that off at the end of the year. It's free for you. And so I think it's incredibly important that we begin promoting that. In the city of Denver, we're going to begin to start pushing a transit demand management plan that other cities have implemented, which is incredibly important for our transit stops. And I tell you, at 38th and Blake, what we're doing now is doing a value capture. So those who are going up in zoning from 8 stories to 16 stories, and you're near a transit stop, you need to provide 10% affordable housing, and also 10%, commercial office space, artist office space. Those are some of the things that we're trying to push in this, because we agree with you. I think if you're near transit, I mean, you have to have these options.
Great. I'll just ask one more so we can get to the audience questions, but clearly affordable housing is an important issue for lots of reasons. Displacement is a real concern, right? Where people are no longer able to stay in the neighborhoods they've lived in for long periods of time. just the value of a diverse population, right, throughout Metro Denver and equity issues. But, you know, one of the, I think, overarching concerns is that affordable housing is actually going to dampen or affect economic growth. And, you know, I'm just curious to hear the panel's opinion on whether there's any evidence that it is affecting economic growth, or, you know, maybe some very clear fears, right, going forward of the effect of the housing prices.
I mean, I'll just go first and just say that I don't think that there's any evidence that it can. There's some concerns, but I don't think there's any evidence that it can affect economic growth. And I'll just share an isolated story that there is a former board chair of the Downtown Denver Partnership who was talking about the workforce development issues that we're facing in the city right now, and that he had a head cook that he wanted to hire from Wyoming, and Laramie, Wyoming, and it was that cook had the same job offer in Wyoming. The major decision was the housing price. That job was actually the same pay, but the housing price here was incredibly more. I think we have an opportunity to lift up our workforce development issue around affordable housing as well. I mean, there's a ton of evidence, you know, all over the country around providing affordable housing, lifting, lifting up your workforce as well, which is going to get to the economy. And so I don't think there's any evidence, but I'd be interested to hear what our panelists have to say. Right.
Yeah. So I divide the world, as people who know me, in between advocates and policy folks. From the advocate side, yes, I want it to be one more reason to have affordable housing. But if you look at the centers of growth right now, they all have housing issues. People are moving to Seattle. People are moving to San Francisco. People are moving to high-cost areas. People are moving to urban centers. It comes down to, do we compete well with Dallas? Do we compete well with Chicago and Salt Lake City? That's where the question, it's one more factor, and you want to make sure that you can address that issue when you're an economic developer. But if you're living here and you're a business and you have to pay a wage for quality of life, it drives up the cost of doing business here, no doubt. And that's where it becomes both a quality of life and an economic condition. But from a development standpoint, gosh, people are swarming to those areas that are very high cost. It's just amazing. They'll double up to live in a very attractive place.
I would just add two things to that. One is if you talk to Irv's counterpart in the Governor's Office of Economic Development, they will tell you when they deal with the site selectors that are consulting with those businesses looking where to move, if it's not the first question, it's the second question, is they want to understand the diversity of housing. They want to know that their employees can get housing. And you think about what you spend on housing determines what your disposable income is that you can spend on other things. And that's a huge economic driver for these areas. The second thing I would say from a data-driven standpoint is the research is fairly clear that affordable housing, particularly, I'd say LIHTC housing in particular, there's a study done that was released just recently through Trulio, the real estate site, and they looked at a number of metro areas, and it either had no impact or it had a positive impact. And Denver was one of those cities that LIHTC housing actually brought up neighboring real estate values and were already fairly high value. So there is data, empirical data, to suggest that on the contrary, it's actually good for the neighborhood and it's good for the housing values.
I might just add, so I'm also the treasurer of the Downtown Denver Partnership, and I can tell you that at least downtown, affordable housing as an issue, and really just cost of living, cost of doing business in downtown Denver is getting more and more expensive, significantly more expensive. Our property taxes in the city of Denver over the last 4 years are up almost 70%. Now that's largely due, some of those is mill levy increases. Some of that has to do with mill levy increases, I should say. Some of that has to do with assessed values going up significantly, but next year is another reassessment year. So we expect our property taxes to go up significantly again next year. And if you look at the CAM charges, the common area maintenance charges in buildings in downtown because of taxes, because of the cost of housing, et cetera, downtown, there are businesses now, I can absolutely tell you, that are moving to the suburbs because they can't afford to be in downtown Denver anymore operationally, and affordable housing is a piece of that. But it's all those things. You know, we can't just keep continuing to increase taxes, increase fees, increase cost of living, cost of doing business, and not at some point reach a tipping point where that decision, that value proposition is going to tip hopefully somewhere else in the metro area, and those jobs stay here, but it potentially to other lower cost of living locations like a Salt Lake City, like a Kansas City, like other Phoenix cities that are trying to compete with Denver.
Thank you. Well, I'll go ahead and turn it over to the audience for to get some of its expertise. There is a microphone that can follow around, and please do introduce yourself before asking the question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Catherine. Phil Cernanek. I'm on the City Council in Littleton. I'm on the Dr. Cog Board. I'm chair of the Advisory Committee on Aging for the 8 counties, and I've served on one of the subcommittees for the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging at the state level. One of the things that is imminently before us is what to do with seniors in the state, and what are we going to be doing in that regard. Folks want to stay where they are, at least be within those communities where they are, and many of them have actually gotten to the point where they own their home. And given the alternatives with an unpredictable rental housing environment and what happens to those costs going forward, they'd like to be looking at owning something that is in their same community, but is for them affordable and can have that fixed cost aspect. One of the things that, as Mr. Coyle has mentioned, certainly that is on the table over the last 5 years is construction defects litigation, and looking at that reform, which has the possibility of having higher density housing in some of our suburbs. And just to underline some of the suburbanization of poverty, I was recently at a career day at a high school in Douglas County. 30% of the students were identified as homeless. So it's not just a Denver issue. Now, those folks aren't necessarily on the streets, but they may be couch surfing or family surfing as they're going through this. What are you, as each of the panel members, doing to see that construction litigation reform occurs at the state level to bring back the large insurers to make it much more affordable for the builders to deal with? And if you aren't doing anything, what are you doing for those folks that can be doing something to get that litigation reform through our legislature?
Thank you for your question, Phil. I knew it was coming. The city of Denver, along with many other metros, city and counties, have taken on kind of a municipal action on the construction defect, and we did that a year ago under the leadership of our mayor. And so I think what you're going to find is complete support on Denver City Council moving forward. What I'm doing actively is texting my colleague, who is now the Speaker of the House, and seeing, which is Crisanta Durant, she represents this district too. You can text her too. Seeing what we can do to move this forward. It's time. What more evidence, what more proof do you need that the pressure valve needs to be released in this city? And it's primarily in my district, needs to be released. There's apartments going up everywhere. but we are not seeing that in for sale condos. And we know that it's primarily on this litigation, and it's around affordable housing. So anyway, that's what we're doing, and we're actively lobbying our Denver delegation at the state.
So I'll take this one on too, and I'm not running for political office, obviously, and at later years in my career, so I can be completely blunt, and I will. You know, as a community, I think we should be embarrassed by what's happened with, and I call it construction liability issues, not construction defect issues, but the other side wants to call it construction defects. But from a construction, since it is, everyone knows it as construction defects. You know, we've had the votes at the legislature for the last 3 years to get this changed. Let's be clear what's happened, okay? There's one person, a Boulder Democrat, who everyone should know if you know this issue, who has not let this come out of our committee. And the trial attorneys are controlling her and Democratic members of the House and Senate, and that's what's going on here. So we shouldn't call it anything other than that. There's a community will to get this passed. The community wants more condos in every part of the state. And what's holding it up are the trial attorneys who are paying off certain members of our legislature at the state level. That's what's happening here. We shouldn't call it anything other than that. And I'm very hopeful that Christina can make a change and can really influence change, because it's about time, and we really need to move on as a community, I think.
Let me just add on to that, Phil. Thank you for the question. And if you think about a continuum, and on the one side, you've got high density multifamily, and on the other side, you've got single family. We see a lot of activity at both ends of that continuum. What people talk about, you hear the term the missing middle. And the missing middle really refers to a lot of those things some of those things the city can do through accessory dwelling units and trying to create some density in places where it historically hasn't been. But condos create an opportunity for home ownership that if anyone was here in Denver in the early and the mid 90s, you knew that condos for $50,000, you could get a condo and be a homeowner. And then you moved on. You may not even sell it. Maybe you saved it, you rented it out. It was a wealth generator for somebody who was at fairly low wages early in a career. And we don't have that today. And so when you think about just as the continuum of housing, politics aside, if you look at the number of condo units that come out of the ground as a percentage of the housing stock and compare us to any other city in the United States, it's woefully inadequate. I mean, we're single digit percentages, and we should be in the 15 to 20% range.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, in the back.
Yes, it's interesting, obviously, conversation. And so far, as with the exception of this discussion just now about the condos, the talk has been about more money and more money. My question is there are usually two ways you can address a problem. One is, of course, more money. The other is to potentially lower the costs. Now, I recognize that labor costs and land costs in Denver are going up right now. But I've also heard the comment that this fund has been created by putting additional fees on developers and so on. When I've heard from developers, I've said, there's a huge demand out there for low-income housing. Why aren't you meeting that? Isn't this a marketing opportunity? The answer is we can't afford to, because we can't build a unit today that a low-income person can pay for. Is there a possibility of finding ways to lower the costs of development? I have heard from many builders that the costs of permits, fees, and regulations is so large that it dramatically impacts their ability to build the unit at a cost. Has the city or anybody considered ways to lower the cost of a development?
Let me just, we're very concerned about this at Chaffin. So this year we commissioned a study to look at the cost of, it was focusing on multifamily development. And the increases we've seen are astounding over the past 5 to 6 years. And what does it do? It's fewer units, right? There's no more money. You're just building fewer units. That's the problem. So some of the things we can't control, labor costs, it's hard to control labor material costs, but those fluctuate with the economy. We accept those. I'll tell you what you can do. Look around the metro area. Mike is willing to be bold. He'll tell you which cities that you can just plan on another 20 or 30% cost because of tap fees, requirements around what the structure has to look like, not building code, but and so there are opportunities to drive down costs. But unfortunately, it's going to be city to city, municipality to municipality. It's not something that generally can be done as a one size fits all. So that's an area where we're starting to ask ourselves, is there an opportunity to drive that cost down? Because we're just building fewer units with the same amount of money.
You asked the question earlier about leadership, and then so as to the various costs of housing in different jurisdictions, that's one of the low-hanging fruit that could be addressed. The variable cost, the high cost, and it's present, and it should be on the table for conversation.
I think there is a direct correlation between the cost of fees and permitting and the rents or the cost of housing in those locations. And the poster child is, of course, Boulder, that has the highest fees in the metro area, and not surprisingly has the lowest amount of supply and has the highest rents in the metro area. So there's absolutely a direct correlation between the cost of housing as a consumer, as a renter or a homeowner, and the fees that the jurisdiction imposes.
We have a question up front. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Bill James. I'm on the board of directors at RTD for about another week. So I don't have to be politically correct either, Mike. A lot of the tension here has been on transportation as well as housing. And I appreciate the comments about RTD. And yes, we are moving in a direction where we're integrating those to a much greater degree. Our former general manager of RTD used to call it a three-legged stool: housing, jobs, and transportation. The jobs component of that hasn't gotten a lot of attention by us here this morning. And another corollary of that is education. And to relate it, I guess, how do we make it so that somebody that's at 50% of AMI can get to 100% of AMI? How do we improve the community in those kinds of ways? I'm just curious, the members of the panel are parts of organizations that really don't have jobs as being a direct part of the agenda that you have. Albus, perhaps your broader perspective you do. But I'm interested in your comments on how we can integrate these things. Those three things tend to be in silos. We try to integrate them together, but as a community decision-making, how can we make it so that we can improve the community and the job side of it and the education side of it better?
I appreciate the question. And on the heels of working on the affordable housing, which affordable housing is not done, I just want to be clear, just because we got 150 million, I think we're on a trajectory to continue to do better and put better policy out there. But my focus has been workforce development. And I always use my district as a test case of the economic engine of downtown Denver. There is, we're at full unemployment, 2.9%, which means we have more jobs than we do people to fill them. And just 8 blocks north, we have the highest unemployment, some of the highest unemployment, triple the unemployment in the city. And 5 blocks north of that, the same thing. And so we're not doing as good of a job as we think we're doing on workforce development. The pipelines to opportunities are not there. We're not finding folks, training them for the skills that they need to be successful in the city. And so I'm working with a number of organizations, including OED, trying to figure out how do we create those pipelines into these industries that we have all over our city. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. That third piece of the stool that our friend Mr. Washington always talked about is very important, and it's something that is a strategic area for the city.
other thoughts on Travis?
You know, there really are two pieces to that. One is the future generation. So you look at education, and we know that the turnover, so housing creates a lot of turnover in the schools. And if you talk to some of the schools that face that, it's not just the 50% turnover in the students' disruption on those kids who have to move classrooms and schools because they don't have housing stability, but it's the disruption to the other kids in the classroom. So everybody's impacted. So you've got to deal with the education issue first. But in terms of those who are already in the workforce, I don't know that we always attract the right kinds of businesses to address the issue to those neighborhoods. And Paul Washington in the mayor's office done an amazing job of saying, we looked at the area, we asked ourselves, what is a living wage? Okay, now let's connect. What are the kinds of businesses that would allow a worker in that neighborhood with reasonable amount of training that we could provide to work at that plant and earn that living wage? So Pena Station, Panasonic's not going to be that entry-level workforce for a living wage. But identifying those workforces for those neighborhoods to allow them to get, you got to take those steps up. And the city of Denver's done really an amazing job with that. And this is not an easy task, because now you're trying to match the right employer with a reasonable amount of training to bring those employees up to say, now you're at a living wage. Now the next step, let's continue to grow that. So those are the two issues that we see. And we are, well, you kind of know, Jeff, we're housing and economic development. So we look at both of these issues. So thank you.
Let me just piggyback on that, and I appreciate those comments. And the city of Denver is doing a better job. We're nowhere close to where we need to be until we have industry employers saying, "Oh, there's the pool. There's where we go." And I think as a community, the business community, government, advocates, we have to come together and say, you know what, we've got to invest in trade schools. Not everyone is going to go to college for a 4-year education, go into debt, and then figure out where they need to be employed. We need to get folks skills right now, today, for the labor force.
Just a brief comment and move this jobs conversation outside Denver. If you look at the smaller communities, and we do, that's where you are, it's a different jobs question, and you have 2 and 3 jobs in order to live there. You actually have, and if you read the most recent clips this past week, Vail and ski companies are investing in housing to keep the job, to attract the job. It is connected. So it is front and center in your smaller community, more so than in the metro area. You don't see it as prevalent. It gets lost in all of the conversation. But in the small towns, it is every day.
So I have started a nonprofit that's called it's home sharing. And so using your numbers, there are 55,000 seniors 65 and older living in single family residences. So it is a lot of existing housing stock that you don't need to build, and by slowly, safely, and thoughtfully matching the senior who then can stay in their home, because our seniors are losing their homes because they can't afford the taxes, they can't afford the upkeep. And so all of the conversations that I keep hearing are about building more buildings. We need to build more buildings. We need to do this. But I am wondering, in these pot of funds, are there opportunities for nonprofits that are thinking outside the box? So for less than $1,000 per match, we are able to get somebody into an affordable housing unit and support a senior to stay at home. So they can get rides, they can get to the grocery store, they can get to the doctor, and they're not socially isolated. And so what I am wondering is, in these conversations and at the different levels in city and county and state, are there opportunities for organizations to use that existing housing stock to build affordable housing and apply for funds?
I'd say on the Denver perspective, 100% yes. And I'd love to get your information and connect you with our OED department and have a conversation to put a direct proposal in front of
The state perspective, the question earlier was about what the state's role is from a leadership. When it comes to people, that's hopefully where we are in the lead. And we take that lead when it comes to partnering with our Department of Human Services, partnering with our Medicaid offices, partnering with other state departments. And Governor Hickenlooper and Irv Halter, who is the Director of Local Affairs, has really taken the lead to make sure that individuals don't fall between that crack. And where that's happening most is in housing and in services. Whether we're modifying a home for people to live there longer, whether we're making sure that it's safe and the services are available. We're going to great lengths to make sure, number one, it happens. Number two, it's quality service. Number three, it's very efficient.
But right now, it's not even affordable. Our
Correct.
low-income seniors that have houses cannot afford $20 an hour to pay somebody to come in and help them in their homes.
Right.
So we have to be thinking outside the box.
Yeah. And outside the box is where I spend most of my time. just saying. And so you come and talk to us, and I've heard about your organization and what you're doing. We want to be as supportive as we can be.
And related to that question, I think the partnership was mentioned, and we definitely acknowledge the importance of the nonprofit sector as well. And it didn't work out for someone to be on the panel from that sector, but I'm glad that they are in attendance. And I believe we have time for probably one more question. Yeah, Monica.
Hi, I'm Monica Clark Peterson. I work at SB Clark Companies. We're financial advisors in the affordable housing realm. And I'd love to hear from the panel just a little bit more on the impact of the changes at the federal government level on affordable housing. Steve Johnson, of course, mentioned investor pricing dropping from $1.31. We've seen it go down to 90, 95 cents. So that's a huge decrease. We also know that housing vouchers have been limited or frozen in some programs because funding for HUD is uncertain. Vouchers allow the federal government to cover some of the rent payment on very low income individuals, which allows the developers to cover their debt service on the loans they took out to build the building. So it's an essential piece. Can you talk a little bit how we keep the momentum in the state and the city going in the face of huge federal changes, or at least a slowdown?
Steve? You brought it up.
Thanks, Pat. Well, I hope this is a group conversation. So let me speculate a little bit. There are things that, just be very frank about some things that I think that are at risk. Tax reform means if you reduce a tax, you've got to eliminate a tax expenditure, right? And if you look at the top 10 tax expenditures at the federal level, number one is the write-off we'll get for our health benefits, and then our home mortgage deduction, and then child tax credit, and then the earned income credit. Which of those do you think we're going to get rid of? Well, we're going to move on down the list, and you look at tax-exempt bonds that every city in America uses. It's not real big. Well, it's like medium-sized, but is their lobby so what we worry, one of the things I think we should worry about is in that chess game of tax reform, or what are those things that are going to be on the table? Luckily, the low-income housing tax credit program, I think, has strong bipartisan support, but it's not the only. It's just one piece of that. So I would just say on the national level, tax reform is one issue. Let me. Cohn Resnick is in a firm that does a lot of work in the affordable housing industry, an accounting firm, and they put out a blog a while back. And one of the comments they made was that the one positive side you could look at HUD is having somebody who's very articulate that can tell a story may be a benefit to HUD if it's the right story that can be told, because you've got somebody in Dr. Carson that can perhaps tell a story and do it in a very articulate way. And if you can set a path and drive a story and somebody who understands it, it may not be the end of the world. And so we're trying to find some optimism in these things. And I think we've got a story that's been told about affordable housing locally. And in the state of Colorado, we've got a governor who's been incredibly supportive of affordable housing. So it can be done in a state that is a very independent state. And I think that same opportunity is there nationally if the message is told. And it's really, frankly, up to us to tell that story nationally.
So I won't address the instability in the financial markets because that is key, and it will cause havoc. It will cause people to pause. You can't pause. The other side of it is what I'm hearing and seeing is more about people, and it's judgments, and it's wrong. We fought for a long time about this judgment when it comes to public policy. Again, the advocate policy side, don't judge somebody to be worthy when they're poor. Are they worthy for help? Everybody has a right. And where I see things changing is in that conversation, in that dialogue. That then affects where we're going to put money. And it comes down to judgments. Immigration policy is just one of those, but there's a whole lot of other judgments that are being made.
Okay, well, on such an optimistic note, we do try to wrap up on time to respect everybody's schedules, but please join me in thanking the panel and thank you for attending and all of your questions.